my name is Abdiel Vázquez. This is Maestro in Tune, and it's a pleasure to be here with you again. What you were listening at the beginning is something fascinating that has rocked the music world. It has made shock waves over the last week, and it's the discovery of a new piece by Frédéric Chopin. And he's one of the most researched and studied composers in history. So it's very surprising to find a new piece, something nobody had heard before. It was hidden in some private collection for already many decades, and some researcher stumbled onto it. He was very intrigued by the fact that it did say Chopin, it did say Waltz, it had music notation. This guy who did the research is a musicologist. So he went and played it, and he was like, this sounds like Chopin. So a whole thing started where you have to bring specialists, people in forensics, in calligraphy, to check if the paper is the paper that Chopin uses, and the ink, and all of these things. Eventually, the specialists confirmed this is indeed a Chopin original. So the whole thing was amazing news in the world of music. But what was also really fun is the fact that right away, in today's era of information, that spreads like wildfire, the music was uploaded online. And not just the manuscript, but also people took the care to go ahead and transcribe it, like in the computer, in notation that would be much more easy to read. And it's now easily and freely accessible to anyone in the world. So what happened over the last week is that dozens and dozens of pianists everywhere have given it a shot, because this piece is just 40 seconds. It has a repeat sign, so you play it twice, which is what I did in the recording. So it's like 1 minute and 20 seconds. And if you have the piano chops to do that, you can play a newly discovered piece by Chopin in the comfort of your own home. And this is something incredible, that adds to how fascinating this whole thing is. And even if you didn't have the forensic calligraphy historical confirmation, you would hear this piece and you would notice that this is unmistakably Chopin. Now, why am I talking about all this? What am I going to talk about today? This idea of all these interpreters from all over the world suddenly giving it a shot to this new piece made it very clear to me how this phenomenon in classical music is very present today, this idea of the interpreter. The reality is that classical music sustains itself today by the role of the interpreters, people like myself who are not composers. We, not necessarily, at least, a lot of us aren't. We dedicate ourselves to the works of other people. And this is purely a classical music phenomenon. Of course, you have this, it definitely in all other music genres, but it is not the norm. It's the exception. People do covers, even singer-songwriters do covers of songs of other people. But normally you expect any band, any star, anyone to be performing original music. And this was also the case when it comes to what we now call classical music. Back then in the 18th, 19th century, the norm was for the audience to come and listen to new music, to listen to the newest. And the other norm was for the composers themselves to be performing their own music. So if you were in the 18th century and you happened to hear a symphony by Mozart, very much likely you will have seen Mozart himself at the podium conducting. Or if you were to hear a Beethoven sonata, you would have seen Beethoven himself at the piano. And that was the norm. It would be very strange for a composer to play other people's music. And likewise, it would sometimes even be strange to repeat music that had already been premiered or performed. This started changing at the turn of the 19th century, so from the 18th to the 19th, so the 1800s. Because, first of all, the music was incredible. It was not worth it to have it performed only once. And second, the music required a level of a specialization because of its difficulty, that now you needed people that were exclusively interpreters that could dedicate their time to practice and to rehearse and to study this music as opposed to the role of the composer. So, talking about this, I want to talk about one of my heroes today. If not, probably my biggest one in terms of how I relate to him, or how I connect to him. And he's probably the first like real interpreter in history, in the history of classical music. And his name was Hans von Bülow. And if you haven't heard his name, I don't blame you. He's not a well-known name. And of course, at least not outside the world of classical music. And the reasons why he is known for otherwise are not necessarily musical, and I'll tell you a little bit about this. But the reason why he's not necessarily well known the way the other great romantics like Chopin or Liszt or Brahms are known, or Wagner, is precisely because he was not a composer. So at a time when we have no recordings, his legacy basically is lost in time. The only people who could see his greatness, who could witness his greatness, were the people who were there in the audience. So we don't have any records of how he sounded, but what I want to talk about today is how he was present in key moments in the history of classical music, and that makes him an incredibly historical figure in the Romanticism. So I'm gonna nerd out a little bit on you. Hopefully it's interesting, especially if you're interested in classical music. I'm gonna mention some pieces, some famous works that if you know them, you will definitely know what I'm talking about. And if you don't, I suggest you go and listen to them, because they are some of the most important pieces, works, most beautiful works in history. And Hans von Bülow was there when it happened. So Hans von Bülow was a German musician born in 1830, and he eventually became known as a concert pianist, as a orchestral conductor, both of symphonic music and of opera. He was also a coach for singers, and he was also a piano teacher, a piano pedagogue, an educator. So if you know anything about me, you can see how I very much feel identified with him. Plus, he was also very outspoken, very political, had very strong views, had a very sharp wit and sense of humor. So this is a person that I really sort of from the beginning identified myself with when I first learned who he was. And this other detail will also be funny, just as an extra icing on the cake. His parents wanted him to be a lawyer. In my case, they wanted me to be an engineer. So he went to Leipzig to study law. He was already, of course, a trained musician. You know, he had taken lessons as a child, but there was no way his parents would authorize him to become a professional musician. Well, he did anyway. He came to Leipzig. He heard Franz Liszt playing. He heard Richard Wagner conducting, and he decided he was gonna do music full time, which is kind of what I did when I was 21 years old. Unfortunately, I did not get to listen to Liszt or Wagner live. So Hans von Bülow went on to study with these two figures, and they were older than him. And to give you a little bit of context of when Hans von Bülow was born, this is 1830, right? So when he's a teenager or a young person, it's 1845, 1850. Beethoven died in 1827, which means that by this time Beethoven was already a legend. Chopin was born in 1810, Liszt was born in 1811, Wagner was born in 1813. So that means that by the time that Hans von Bülow is reaching his youth, these towering figures in music are already like in their 30s, almost their 40s. So they're already a big presence in the world of music. So Hans von Bülow goes, and he's very talented, and he's very hardworking and dedicated, and he studies with Franz Liszt, and he studies with Richard Wagner, which must have been incredible, and he earns the trust of both of them. So I'm gonna start first with the first historical moment in the life of Hans von Bülow, which was the premiere of Liszt's sonata in B minor. Now, Liszt, as I shared with you in the second episode, is famous for being the most greatest pianist of all time, the most flashy, virtuoso at the piano. But this was a period that only really lasted 12 years, when he was touring the world like a rock star. Later, Liszt dedicated himself to composing, to furthering the romantic movement, intellectually, musically, supporting young musicians, amongst them Hans von Bülow. And then he also decided to compose pieces that have even more depth to them. And at the pinnacle of these works, and at the pinnacle of the piano repertoire of the Romantic period, is his sonata in B minor. And this is a complex piece, 30 minutes long, that basically carries us through everything that Liszt is: the virtuosity, the romanticism, the singing, all the feelings expressed, and plus a form that had never before been experimented with when it comes to a sonata. So it was a before and after in the history of piano. By this time, Liszt was not actively concertizing, so he entrusts the premiere of this piece to Hans von Bülow. So Hans von Bülow was there. If this would have been all he did during his life as an interpreter, he would have been in the annals of history. But that was just the beginning for Hans von Bülow. This happened when he was 27 years old, so in 1857. Later on, he became the assistant of Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner is probably the first real conductor who took this profession seriously. He would also teach conducting. He is a person who transformed how we understand orchestras. Like any composer today that composes for orchestra owes a little bit of themselves to Richard Wagner or to Ludwig van Beethoven. So Richard Wagner was actively working on his operas, and his operas also marked a before and after. And amongst them, probably the most well-known and the one that really became a point of reference for all composers moving forward was Tristan und Isolde, who ended up premiering that piece after more than 60 rehearsals. That was Hans von Bülow. In 1865, 35 years old, Wagner entrusts Hans von Bülow with the premiere of his most important work at the time. So when the curtains opened, this was in Munich. There he was, Hans von Bülow, once again making history. Now, life went on for him, and here we arrive to the point for which Hans von Bülow is the most famous. And I find it very unfair, but this is just how history works. And it's the fact that Hans von Bülow had married Cosima Liszt, the daughter of Franz Liszt, the daughter of his teacher. And it seems to have been a beautiful, normal relationship at the beginning. But later, Cosima and Richard Wagner had a liking for each other. Cosima was smitten by Wagner's talent. Wagner was famously, always looking for his next muse. And in this case, he found her in Cosima. So this became an open secret. At some point, Hans von Bülow would travel. Hans von Bülow would actively be conducting Wagner's pieces. And meanwhile, Wagner, who was a friend of the family, would stay in their home and everything. Eventually, Cosima had the third kid. She had already had 2 kids with Hans von Bülow. She has a third kid, but people start, doing their calculations and figuring it out. Wait, Hans von Bülow was traveling, etc. It became a very open secret that Richard Wagner and Cosima Liszt were having an affair. And indeed, they were. So it was painful, it was hurtful, because the press had a field day with this. There were cartoons in the press where they would depict, Wagner and Cosima walking, arm by arm in the front, while Hans von Bülow is in the back, busy with Wagner's own scores, studying them. So they were really mocking Hans von Bülow, and of course, in this time, mocking his honor, his manhood, his virility, and all of that. And Hans von Bülow just took on all of this. He did try to save the marriage. Once the third child of Cosima and Richard Wagner was born, it was just impossible, So these kids were named Isolde and Eva, like characters in Wagner's operas, and finally Siegfried. So at that moment, Bülow finally divorced. It was painful. But even after that, and this is part of what also is Bülow's call to fame, is that even after this, he would keep performing Wagner's work. He never talked to Richard Wagner again, but he appreciated who he was as an artist, and how important he was for the development and for the progress of music. At least that's how he saw it at that time. So that's probably Hans von Bülow's biggest call to fame. If people know him at all, it's like, oh, of course, Richard Wagner took his wife. But that's really not all of what Hans von Bülow is. After this whole crisis, he went and just found his solace in music, and he started becoming a piano pedagogue. And he became one of the most sought after pedagogues in Europe, and he developed systems, he developed methodologies that are still in use to this day. Anyone who has studied piano pedagogy is in some way or another influenced by Hans von Bülow, even if it's not necessarily acknowledged, because by now there are already so many systems and methods. But the reality is that Hans von Bülow was the first one to really put this in a methodological way on this is what a pianist needs to do if they want to become a real masters of their craft. So you start with the Czerny etudes or the Hanon etudes or the Kramer, and then you move on to Clementi, and then you move on to Chopin, and then you move on to Liszt, and you have to perform the Bach preludes and fugues, and you have to perform the Beethoven sonata. So all of this systematic way of building piano technique was the first one to really put this all together was Hans von Bülow. Here we have him again, inserting himself in history, in the history of interpreters of other people's music. So life moved on for Hans von Bülow. He becomes a conductor of the Meiningen Orchestra, and it just so happens that Hans von Bülow was also great at forming orchestras. He became famous all over Europe because of the discipline and the work ethic of his orchestra. When they started, they locked themselves for 2 months in the summer to just study and rehearse Beethoven's symphonies. That's it. Nothing else, no live concerts, no other repertoire. And this was a way for them to get to know each other as an ensemble, to play together, to find their sound, to listen to each other. When they came out, they became famous because they would perform by memory all their repertoire. And this is incredible. All orchestras today, and for a long time, they of course have the music in front of them. It's too much to ask for them to learn the pieces by memory. They would perform by memory. And they would also perform standing up. Hans von Bülow believed that that's the only way to really have the energy needed for the music. And he is probably correct. So he forms orchestras, so students start coming to him to study conducting and to, try themselves to learn how to form an orchestra, how an orchestra should sound. So amongst those students was Johannes Brahms, again, another towering figure in the history of classical music. And what would happen here is that not only would Hans von Bülow give a platform for the music of Brahms, he would also let Brahms conduct. So another premiere, another moment in history, and this happened already later in life. This is already around 1882. And Brahms gets to premiere his fourth symphony with the Wagner Orchestra, his last symphony. Brahms only composed 4 symphonies. The 4 of them are part of the repertoire. All orchestras in the world sustain themselves with the symphonies of Beethoven, the symphonies of Brahms, the symphonies of Tchaikovsky. So when you're talking about the last symphony by Brahms, you're talking about one of the most important works in the canon of classical music, premiered by Hans von Bülow's orchestra. Why did Hans von Bülow not conduct? Because he gave the chance to Johannes Brahms. Hans von Bülow was there in the preparation. He prepared the orchestra, and then in the performance, he was like, Brahms, you go ahead, you conduct. Which again speaks very well about his own nobility and how he would remove himself, and his ego from what he saw as the biggest mission, which was the music. Now, a few years earlier, there was some other composer, and this is already when Hans von Bülow is famous all over Europe as a conductor. He had a history as a great concert pianist, but he was mostly conducting and also teaching piano. And there was this composer in Moscow called Tchaikovsky. And Tchaikovsky was young, and Tchaikovsky was very talented and very promising, and he went ahead and composed a piano concerto. And at that time, the most famous pianist in Russia, and probably the greatest in the world once Franz Liszt retired, was Anton Rubinstein. So Tchaikovsky bravely brings his new concerto to Anton Rubinstein, and Anton Rubinstein was not very kind to Tchaikovsky. He was like, this is not playable. Forget about this concerto. It will never be done. I refuse to play it. No, thank you. You're very talented, but you go ahead and compose ballets. So Tchaikovsky, heartbroken as he was also undaunted, and you have to give him a lot of credit for that. If the greatest pianist in the world tells you that your piece is no good for the piano, a lot of us would have given up on it. Not Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky did some corrections, did some revisions, and instead of sending the piece to Anton Rubinstein, he goes ahead and sends it to some pianists in Europe, amongst them Hans von Bülow. And Hans von Bülow takes the piece and he tells Tchaikovsky, I will do it. I will play your piece. This is a great piece. I will premiere it. And this piece is Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto number 1. Once again, we are in the presence of probably the most important piece for soloist and orchestra in history, or one of the most, if anything, the most successful in the box office. The Piano Concerto by Tchaikovsky definitely is up there in the concertos for piano and orchestra, but even for all instruments. This is there at the pinnacle, at the summit of what has been composed for this type of ensemble. So Hans von Bülow, at the age of 45, in 1875, he does the very first performance of Tchaikovsky's concerto, and he proves to the world, he proves to Tchaikovsky that indeed not only is this a playable piece, but it is one of the most incredible pieces ever written for piano and orchestra, and today it's still one of the most performed. So that's Hans von Bülow for you. Once again, inserting himself as an interpreter in historical moments in classical music. When he was in his orchestra, 2 other students came to him. And if you're familiar with classical music, you will recognize the names right away. One of them was Richard Strauss, and the other was Gustav Mahler. So they came to him. They were both pianists. They were both highly gifted pianists. So Hans von Bülow took them under his wing to become his assistants, his students, his conducting students, to conduct operas, to conduct symphonies, and also as composers. He respected them both very much as composers, and he would also encourage them to compose, to perform their pieces. So Richard Strauss, of course, he became a towering figure at the turn of towards the 20th century. His operas are incredible, his symphonic works, and not only that, he also became a mentor of conductors. One of his students was Fritz Reiner, who later came to the Curtis Institute of Music and had this wonderful studio, one of his students was Leonard Bernstein, one of the most influential musicians in history. So you have all this legacy stemming from Hans von Bülow. And the other one was Gustav Mahler. So I have two final stories to tell you about Hans von Bülow and his contribution to history as an interpreter. The first one has to do with Beethoven and with Liszt. So Hans von Bülow never left the piano. Even though he was busy as you can be, conducting his own orchestra, touring the world, and teaching, he would still see as a mission to perform the music that needed to be performed from his point of view. And amongst this was the music of Beethoven. Because see, at this time, the music of Beethoven, especially the late sonatas, were not considered playable for regular audiences. They were considered too complex, too deep, too difficult. If anything, people would perform the Pathétique Sonata or the Moonlight Sonata, but definitely not the Hammerklavier and all those other late works. Von Bülow took it on himself to present these works to the audience, to the regular audiences, because he saw it as his mission not only for these works to be known, but also to educate audiences. So he would do recitals of all of Beethoven's works, of Beethoven sonatas over the course of many days. And especially the last 5 sonatas, he would perform them in one evening by memory, which is an incredible feat. In 1881, so this is von Bülow, 51 years old, he does one of these recitals, and his former mentor, Franz Liszt, attends. He's in the audience to watch this recital. And let's remember that Franz Liszt was a student of Czerny. Czerny was a student of Beethoven. So there was a lineage that went from Beethoven to Liszt to von Bülow. I can't imagine the pressure of having Franz Liszt in the audience if you're going to play Beethoven's last 5 sonatas. So after the concert, Liszt writes an open letter to the newspaper. And this is what he says. He says, "You want to know my impression of yesterday's Bülow's concert? Certainly it must have been the same as yours, as that of us all, that of the whole of the intelligent public of Europe. To define it in 2 words, admiration, enthusiasm. 25 years ago, Bülow was my pupil in music. Just as 25 years earlier, I myself had been the pupil of my respected and beloved master, Czerny. But to Bülow, it is given to do battle better and with more success than I. His admirable Beethoven edition is dedicated to me as, quote, the fruit of my teaching. Here, however, the master learned from the pupil. And Bülow continues to teach by his astonishing virtuosity at the keyboard, as well as by his exceptional musical learning, and now too by his matchless direction of the Meiningen Orchestra. There you have the musical progress of our time." The master learned from the pupil. Can you imagine any teacher saying that about their student? Is what all students dream of. But Franz Liszt saying that. And about Bülow's interpretations of Beethoven sonatas. That just tells you the level of devotion and commitment of Hans von Bülow as an interpreter, and how as an interpreter he was himself a teacher. He continues to teach. That's what Liszt says. Talking about that, and a small parenthesis before I tell you the other story that I wanted to share with you. In 1882, so Bülow is 52 years old, these musicians in Berlin break off from their orchestra because they felt that they were being exploited, and their conductor wanted to take them on tour, and on the lowest class of tickets in the train and all that. So the musicians were unhappy with him. They decided to break off and form their own orchestra, and they decided to form their own rules. And they're gonna select their own music director themselves by committee, and they're gonna be in charge so that they will never again be exploited. And they had a stint first with one conductor, and the second conductor in their history, the one who really shaped them into who they are today, was Hans von Bülow. They came to him and they're like, please be our music director. We've seen the work that you've done at the Meiningen Orchestra. Please come do it with us. Hans von Bülow did it. And this orchestra is none other than the Berlin Philharmonic. That Berlin Philharmonic that is to this day the reference as the greatest orchestra in the world, if not one of the greatest orchestras in the world. All the recordings by Karajan, Simon Rattle, Furtwängler, all of this is the work started by Hans von Bülow. At the Berlin Hall, they have a statue of him right there as one of the fathers, so to speak, of this great orchestra. So there you have once again Hans von Bülow in the middle of history, carrying music forward thanks to his work as an interpreter. And there's more to him, Walter Damrosch studied with him. He came all the way from New York, and eventually Walter Damrosch came back to the US. Famously in the ship back, he met Andrew Carnegie, and eventually this led to the construction of Carnegie Hall in New York. And Walter Damrosch was also instrumental in the forming of the New York Philharmonic Society, which is by now the New York Philharmonic. So there you have a student of Hans von Bülow, again shaping music, shaping classical music, concert music elsewhere in the world. The final story that I want to tell you has to do with Gustav Mahler, because throughout all this time you have Hans von Bülow championing the works of others, championing the works of young composers, giving opportunities to young performers, and of course being one of the greatest interpreters of the music of the great ones, of the music of Chopin, of the music of Liszt, of the music of Wagner, of the music of Beethoven, and many more. Mozart, of course, lots of operas, Verdi even. At first von Bülow did not like Verdi's music, and then he heard Verdi's Requiem, and he wrote a letter to Verdi saying, you know what, I was wrong, you're one of the greats, and so on. So of course, it was always a moment of excitement and also fear when a composer would bring his works to Hans von Bülow. And probably his closest pupil near the end of his life was Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler was there for everything. He admired Hans von Bülow so much. He actively searched for him. He wrote to him like, I want to study with you, and he learned everything from him. He was a very accomplished pianist. Von Bülow respected him very much like a pianist. Gustav Mahler became one of the greatest conductors in history. Truly, this is Mahler. Before he became known for his symphonies, he became known as a conductor and as a teacher of conductors. So he's already a towering figure in the history of music. But as a composer, von Bülow was not fully convinced. And one time Mahler brought to von Bülow the piece he was working on. And this was the opening of what ended up becoming his second symphony. And this is called the Totenfeier. And if you go listen to this piece today, you'll find a recording on Spotify. The greatest orchestra that you can find. Look for Mahler's Second Symphony, look for the first movement, and you will realize it's not an easy piece at all to listen, especially if you're listening to it for the first time. It's complex and it's long. So Mahler played this at the piano for Hans von Bülow to see what he thought. And Mahler turns around when he finishes, and Hans von Bülow has his hands in his ears, and he says something like, I'm sorry, but if this is what music is now, I don't know what music is, or something of the sort. And you can imagine how devastating it must have been for his student, for Mahler, to hear this. Of course, von Bülow had all the respect for Mahler as a conductor, as a pianist. And Mahler did not take this personally. He continued there being Bülow's most faithful student until Bülow's death. And it was an early death. He died at 72. He famously had these very strong migraines. It ended up being a tumor. Of course, they only found out after he died. So when Bülow dies, they bring him back to Germany. He died, he was vacationing or sort of like healing or recovering in Cairo in Egypt. So they bring him back to Germany, and Mahler is of course there present for all the funeral services. He helps arrange everything. He's, is his teacher, his beloved teacher. And by the time they bring the casket, this choir of children starts singing to these lyrics, Auf Verstehen, these lyrics famously talking about resurrection. And at that moment, Mahler, who had been stuck with his second symphony, suddenly has an epiphany. And that same day, he goes back to the piano and starts putting these lyrics that he had heard to a new melody that was in his ear, in his head. This ends up becoming the epic finale of Mahler's Resurrection Symphony. And to me, this is inspiring in a way that von Bülow, who at some point the music was moving in a direction or faster than he could catch up with it, even in his death, he ended up inspiring this moment. Because if we look at what Mahler is, he was the next step in romantic music, in orchestral music. He moved things forward. So it's always artists build on top of other works. So another clear important moment, just like Tristan and Isolde had been 40 years earlier, was Mahler's Resurrection Symphony. So there you have, once again, Hans von Bülow in the middle of history of classical music as an interpreter, not as a composer. This is, to me, one of the most inspiring things about him. I will leave you now with that. Before I want to tell you, I told you about von Bülow's sharp humor, which sometimes would get him in trouble. And there was in one of the orchestras that he conducted back in the day, before the Meiningen Orchestra, there were two musicians that he did not like very much because they were not very good. And I believe one of them was Otto and the other one was Hans or something like that, some German name. And he would just struggle with them because he couldn't really fire them, but they were not great. Anyhow, one day he arrives to the rehearsal and the staff and everyone is like a little bit mourning because they're like, we're sorry, Maestro, to tell you that Hans passed away last night. And Hans von Bülow, without missing a beat, he asks, what about Otto? And that's exactly who he was. I'm going to leave you now with the final moments of Mahler's Resurrection Symphony. If you have a time to go and listen to everything else I talked about today, please go and do it. When it comes to Liszt, that's Liszt's Sonata in B minor. There's Wagner's Tristan and Isolde. You don't have to listen to the whole opera. Listen to the prelude. Listen to the finale, to the love-death, Liebestod, of the death of Isolde. Go listen to Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1. Go listen to Beethoven's final sonatas. You have to search them as Opus 109, Opus 110, Opus 111. You can listen to Brahms' Fourth Symphony. Listen to the third movement if you want to choose something to listen to. And go listen to Mahler's Symphony. And in this case, I'm going to leave you with the final minutes. And this is actually performed by another great interpreter, my teacher, Enrique Di Mecche, who's a specialist in Mahler. And this was performed at Teatro Colón a few years ago. I hope you enjoy. Thank you for sharing this moment with me, for me to share the history of one of my heroes in music, and to me, a role model on what an interpreter and educator should be. Until next time, My name is Abdiel Vázquez. This is Maestro in Tune.